Welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast, proudly presented by Venture Hunting and Outdoors. If you're like us and passionate about hunting, spearfishing, and many other outdoor-related pursuits, with an eagerness to fast-track your learning, then this is the podcast for you. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast. Today we turn our heads to the west and go across the Pacific to do a deep dive of the North American model of wildlife conservation, often called America's big game system. So what we're going to be looking at there is breaking down how the US have set up this conservation model and how they manage their populations over there. We look into their tag system as well as their 7 core principles of the conservation model and how this differs from Australia's fragmented approach to how we manage our game species over here. This episode is going to be the start and sort of the foundation for us on the Twin Elements podcast for a bit of a little series that we've got going on here where we're going to be talking about the US mainly and how to apply for tags, as well as planning to hunt an elk, a deer, an antelope, a moose, and a few other species along the way. So it's going to end up being about 5 or 6 podcasts. And this one, is mainly just the foundation to give you guys a bit of background knowledge. So when we're having future discussions, you can sort of draw on this that you hear in this initial podcast and understand what we're trying to say and get the messages loud and clear for hopefully being successful for applying for you guys in the future. We'll also be answering a few FAQs along the way that Aiden and I have been sent in. We've had a heap regarding the US in our past, and so today we're going to get to tackling them and answering those questions for you guys. If anyone has a question that they'd like answered on the podcast, please email us at info@twinelements.com.au with the subject line FAQ. Equally, send us a message on social media on our Instagram at Twin Elements, Aiden Doumtsis Outdoors, or James Doumtsis Outdoors. Without further ado, we'll jump into the podcast.
Are you in the market for serious boots for all feet, terrain, and adventures? Well, look no further than Lower Boots. We have been running the Lower Ranger GTX 3s for many, many years now without so much as a blister. The team at Lower have extended their generosity to you, our valued listeners, and supplied us with a unique discount code. Use code TWINELEMENTS10 at checkout for 10% off your next order. Wear Lowers on your next hunt. Your feet will thank you.
So the North American big game model of wildlife conservation is a framework for managing the wildlife populations in both the United States and Canada. So the reason why this came about, this whole model, is essentially that all the wildlife populations were near on the verge of collapse, with most of the game species that you know today almost becoming extinct. So things like bison, turkeys, even elk, whitetail, all these species that we take it granted for today. And you see a lot on social media of people hunting them, but also just taking photos and videos in places like Yellowstone National Park, for example. Well, they were all on the verge of collapse in the late 19th and early 20th centuries due to unregulated hunting and sort of commercial exploitation of the game species, as well as destruction of their natural habitats and home ranges. So with the help of a few key people that I'll mention in a minute, they realized that the game species that are native to the US were pretty much on the brink, and that at this stage the population could be saved with a lot of hard work and the right infrastructure, but left unmanaged, that these populations of wild animals would disappear quite quickly, given the rate that they'd disappeared due to a lot of commercial hunting and whatnot. And so the big game management system was developed, and that mainly revolves around having public land access, science-based ethical hunting to preserve wildlife for future generations of hunting and conservationists. And one of the main players in developing this wildlife conservation system was Theodore Roosevelt. So Theodore, also called Teddy because of his love of bear hunting, was actually the 26th president of the United States. He was a passionate conservationist and outdoorsman, very keen hunter, and what he could see was that the systems that were in place, there was nothing there to protect wildlife. And so he is essentially called the father of the American conservation movement because he set up to establish 230 million acres of public land and national parks, which enabled wildlife refuge, as well as promoting and setting up some of these guidelines that, have led the way and paved the path for this American big game model. Another important player was Aldo Leopold. So he was an ecologist, forester, and also an author of A Sand Country Almanac. He was a pioneer of wildlife ecology and scientific game management. Aldo was also a strong advocate for hunting as a conservation tool, but only when done ethically and scientifically backed. Once again, you hear me use the word science, which is a bit refreshing compared to, what we see here in Australia and even New Zealand at times, where we may not have quite the hunting culture. And so a lot of our, decision making is done through, just politics, which isn't scientifically backed and has a lot of raw emotion in it from certain parties. But what we'll do is we'll just list through and discuss the US model first, and then I'm going to jump back and compare that to what we see sort of here in Australia and New Zealand. So leading on from some of these historic figures that contributed to the North American big game model, it has now been transitioned back to state and federal wildlife agencies, ultimately leading the decision making on managing these wild populations. So state and federal institutions are essentially going to dictate by law what happens to the wildlife within that state, and they're going to be conducting research and managing the populations through the use of their biologists and their game wardens. Now, this is all conducted through public funding. So that's done through tags, duck stamps, and the excise tax. So the excise tax, which some of you may have heard, is called the Pittman-Robertson Act of 1937. So in the Pittman-Robertson Act, what they did was any goods purchased in the outdoor industry, whether that be boots, backpacks, bullets, rifles, anything like that, had a tax on it of 10 to 11%, and then that funding went back into the state's wildlife management funding or budget for the year to then go back and do these studies, be able to fund biologists, fund game wardens, and make sure populations are stable, introduce wildlife corridors, and just make sure that conservation is on the front foot and doing essentially preventative health rather than sort of reactive health, which is super refreshing. And that was all created by Teddy Roosevelt. So this whole system has been in place now for over 100 years. And obviously with a lot of these species coming back from the edge of the brink of extinction, speaks volumes, and is often why sort of the Wildlife Act of the North American system is referred to as, yes, one of the best in the world.
OzCaff Energy helps you power your passion. Designed to be convenient, discreet and portable with rapid energy absorption, these caffeine pouches are centered around adventure. With added benefits such as 0 calories and 0 sugar, what's not to love? Use code TWINELEMENTS for 10% off your next order.
We're now going to talk about the tag system and the 7 principles that hold up the North American model for wildlife conservation. So with the tag system, unlike here in Australia and New Zealand where you can go and shoot whatever you want, whenever you want, in the US, in order to, whether you're hunting on private or public, you need to have a tag for that game species and be hunting within a certain period to legally be able to go and harvest that animal. So importantly as well, that money for that tag, that revenue that's generated goes directly back into wildlife management. And so really you've got this system where hunters are the main contributors paying for conservation and managing the animals as a resource. That money for tags, as well as the money through the Pittman-Robertson tax, also is what goes into supporting habitat management, doing biological studies, paying for game wardens, and also education programs for youth, but also other hunters as well. I'm now going to break down the 7 principles or pillars in which the North American big game conservation model is built. And the first one is all wildlife belong to the people and is managed by the state for public benefit. So breaking that down, what it actually means is whether you're a landowner or whether you live in a city all the wildlife is owned equally by everyone in that state and is managed by the state. So there's state management and there's also federal management of populations, but the wildlife management is mainly done at the state level. So there'll be like Montana Fish and Wildlife, Nevada, Wyoming, all these different states have their own management for the animals in those states. And what that means is that even though you may be a private land owner and you may have, whitetail or mule deer or antelope or elk living on your place, you can't just go and willy-nilly hunt them like here in Australia, where so comparatively to Australia, if you have a deer population or a pig population on your place, you can do whatever you want, whenever you want with that population. Over there, a wild elk on your property means absolutely nothing. And if you were to go and actually harvest that elk, for example, without a tag or out of season, you would be reprimanded by the law, and it would be, it's a pretty big punishment, to be honest. The second principle is prohibition of commercial hunting of big game. So that was one of the big factors that led to the huge decline in the late 19th century of these wild populations of, turkey and bison and all that type of things. So what they did is stop all commercial hunting and the sale of wild meat, just to essentially prevent the overexploitation of a resource. And that's mainly seen in two ways. So the first one is tags are not refundable and specifically allocated to a hunter. So for example, the tag that I drew in 2023 that was a really good tag, for no amount of money, I could transfer that to, Aiden, for example, even if a week out from the hunt I broke my arm, or if someone approached me and said, hey, I'll pay you $20,000 for that tag. And what that just does is it prevents over-harvesting and sort of the commercial possession, I guess, of tags and the opportunity for people to go and, have the ability to do commercial harvesting of wild game, because it's so hard, as you guys have probably found out or will find out in this podcast series, for people to actually sort of get enough tags to do it even at a commercial level. Like we're all sort of struggling just to get enough tags to go out and hunt for ourselves, and often even just get enough meat for our own family and friends, let alone to do it at a commercial level. The other area that this is seen and regulated in is selling wild game meat. So for example, when I killed my elk over there, I just gave the meat to my mate, who helped me with the vehicles and, just organising logistics and lets me store the skulls and stuff at his place. I couldn't sell that meat to him, but I can legally give it to him. Equally, if I was a US resident, just say, if I had killed, 5 elk in a season, and I had a friend that had a lot of salmon, for example, I couldn't sell that elk meat to him or her, but I could give them elk meat in exchange. If they wanted to then give me, wild caught salmon or whatever, then that would be perfectly fine. So in summary, that just translates into essentially if there's any exchange of monetary value for that game meat, then it's illegal. But, if you want to give some to your neighbour, then that's fine. To be fair, that's also similar here in Australia. Like you can't actually sell wild game meat unless it's done through a proper processing plant. And even in the US, that extends to things like roadkill, for example. So if you find an elk dead on the side of the road, you actually need to go and get a vehicle killed wildlife salvage permit. And then the meat can be put in your freezer or given to your family and friends, but it also cannot be sold for that commercial gain. So principle 3 is allocation of wildlife is managed by law. So that essentially means that the wildlife is regulated through the laws of the state. So this is done through that tag system and licensing, and also having, seasons for specific weapons like bow, muzzleloader, rifle, all that type of thing. No one can go and just hunt or take wildlife whenever they want. And that's also translated into fishing and bird hunting and all that type of thing. Even I mentioned landowners before, so they can't, if there's a heap of, mule deer, just say smashing one of their winter crops, for example, they can't just go out and go and shoot one. What they can do is apply for a degradation tag, where the state will, they'll come out and go, yes, you have this many elk on your place, so we'll reward you with an extra couple of cow tags or a couple of extra elk tags or something like that. In certain states where they acknowledge that, they may allow some of these big game species to winter on their place. They actually allocate landowner tags, which those landowners can then sell on to people for, guides and stuff like that to hunt on their place, or they may host people to hunt on their place. But yeah, that you can't just go out and shoot all the elk that are smashing your crop, for example. Interestingly enough, they've actually introduced some new laws even around activities such as shed hunting. So just going up and picking up cast antlers, which is actually massive in the US, and there can be a fair bit of money associated with it. But what they've actually worked out inadvertently, it puts a fair bit of pressure on migrating elk herds during the winter, going out there and trying to find these antlers and stuff. So they've actually allocated laws around, restricting to certain times when you can go and pick up these antlers and stuff like that. And yeah, it's crazy to see just how, science back and regulated a lot of these systems are, and things that we just take for granted here in Australia and New Zealand. So principle 4, which is a big one, and a bit of a contrast here to Australia and New Zealand, and that is wildlife can only be killed for a legitimate purpose. So in which case you must be taking it for food, fur, be shot in self-defense, or property protection. So obviously crop degradation and that type of thing. Often a few of these things double up. Other than self-defense, a lot of the food, fur, and property protection, you're normally acquiring meat or resource in some way, but you simply can't go out there and just shoot whatever you want for sport, or essentially for a wasteful reason. And that's seen laws be developed about taking all available meat and harvesting the animal properly. So this varies depending on location where you are, and also obviously what species. But for example, if you went out and shot a turkey, you would be required to take the breast meat, the thigh meat, and also the drumsticks of a wild turkey. For me, hunting elk in Montana, I'd be required to take all 4 quarters, the back straps, the neck meat, and the 2 tenderloins, and potentially the rib meat. There is the exemption if there's, because it comes down to what is available and usable meat. So if you have meat that it takes a day for you to find the elk, for example, and some of the meat's spoiled, you don't necessarily have to take that out. Equally speaking, if you have a front leg and you've broken the shoulder and there's a lot of bruising and blood damage and that type of thing, you can, have essentially leave that meat behind or trim it away. So yeah, it's just making sure that you take all usable meat that you possibly can. Principle 5 is an interesting one, and that is wildlife is considered an international resource. So like I said before, we've got all these wildlife species that are managed at the state level, but it's also managed as an international resource. And that's because, as they found out, a lot of these animals, especially bird species, obviously have huge migration corridors. So there are birds that, go to South America, that get hunted, like cranes and ducks and all that type of thing, that then migrate everywhere else and around the world, and to different states. So they all work in together. Even mule deer, for example, like there are deer that cross down into Mexico. And it just shows that, essentially the whole system working together, where you don't want to have one place in the migration corridor that, hunts it really hard and wipes it out. Everyone's trying to work together to manage these animals the best they possibly can. Principle 6 is that wildlife policy is all done and constructed through using the best science available. So that is essentially the decision making is done by research back and biological data, not politics, emotion, or tradition alone. So it does take some of these things into account, and we've probably been seeing a little bit more of this of late, especially around sort of predatory hunting and stuff like that, with states trying to get rid of like black bear hunting, hunting of wolves, that type of thing, mountain lion, which obviously have a fair bit of sort of emotional tug for some of these states. In comparison to, generally speaking, they haven't had that much hunting. There hasn't been that much hunting pressure or change from politics and that type of thing for deer and elk. But as we as hunters know, and have seen, for example, in Australia here, first they attacked duck hunting, and then we lost South Australia bow hunting, and the pillars start to fall pretty quickly within Parliament. But over there, a lot of it is backed by science, which is fantastic, and how managing populations should be. So biologists play a large role in deciding the future management of America's big game model, and how their wildlife's going to be, tag allocated, for example. And that's a huge thing, because even as hunters, like, we want to see the animals in thriving populations. And so we're happy, for example, if there's a massive winter kill of mule deer or white-tailed deer where they have a really harsh winter and there's no fawns for a couple of years in a row, and the population gets knocked back 50% from what the home range should be, we're happy to see the tags, essentially decrease by 50% to match that allocation of what the population's doing. Because what the whole system over there is based off is hunting the surplus of a population. So if there is no surplus, then sometimes they'll even just completely close the hunting in that unit for a certain period. Equally though, if there's really good surplus populations where they've had really good seasons, and the deer number or the elk number or the turkey numbers are in higher proportions, then we also see it where the opposite happens, and they allocate more tags than what they usually do. So it may only have 1,000 tags, just say, for elk in that unit, but they might put 1,200 tags, or they might introduce cow tags, or they might give more tags to property owners to help manage the damage that they do to crops and winter pastures and that type of thing. So having that system that's based off science, it's sort of a moving, fluid model, and that's why the biology in these studies are so important, just to make sure that the populations are managed and kept at a healthy level. Like, we don't want things getting overhunted, but equally you don't want populations getting out of control. And the last principle is the democracy of hunting. So that just means that every law-abiding citizen has access to hunting opportunities, not discriminated by wealth or land ownership. So the animals are owned by the state. Everyone has equal hunting opportunities, and equal opportunity is given to anyone that wants it. And so what we see with some of these species that have very limited opportunity and very high demands, for example, like bighorn sheep, we see these things where lottery systems are developed in order to draw tags. And what that means is essentially, you go into a massive pool of a lottery, they might only be 10 tags for a whole unit, or less, 5 tags, to go and hunt one tag sometimes, to go and hunt one of these bighorn sheep. And there might be thousands of people putting in there, but every person is not discriminated on at all. And so they all have equal opportunity to draw that tag, regardless of their wealth, regardless of how many times they've applied before. And that's what the 7th principle is all about, just equal opportunity for hunting access in the US. We all know when it comes to great tasting coffee in the outdoors, look no further than Dog and Gun Coffee. But the same great tasting coffee can also be enjoyed in their whole bean variety in the comfort of your own home. Rounded out with their incredible hog chockey, Dog and Gun has something for everyone. Use code TWIN10 at checkout for $10 off your first order. Discover your brew of choice today. So if we now bring it back to the east and discuss Australia and a little bit of New Zealand's game management systems, we'll bring you guys in on that, show you a bit of love, because we are fairly similar in the sense that, to be honest, we don't really have that much in the way of a structure or a system. There's no national game management systems. At this stage here in Australia, hunting is regulated state by state. So as a fair few of you may know, and me mentioning it before, we obviously lost bow hunting in South Australia not too long ago, in the last sort of 12 months. Tasmania, it's been illegal for ages. We've also seen a recent attack on duck hunting, where it's once again managed state by state. So Victoria, it's becoming more and more regulated. In New South Wales, we actually saw duck hunting become illegal in 1995 due to cruelty issues. You can get these degradation tags and whatnot to hunt ducks essentially on private land due to crop damage and that sort of thing. But as you can see through this short narration, that it's all done state by state, and a lot of the time it's done sadly through political change due to some of these political, I don't want to say radical groups, but ones that probably are a bit misinformed about conservation and hunting and managing populations. And I think the reason why this all comes about is because in Australia here, these animals that we're hunting, so deer and pigs, goats, that type of thing, they're all pest animals. They've all been introduced, even same with New Zealand. And it just has a different sort of connotation. The only animal really that we have here in Australia that's managed is kangaroos that's native. And they do have a tag system and a commercial market set up here in Australia. But most of the other species that we're talking about that we commonly hunt, I wouldn't say people commonly hunt kangaroos. It's more of a commercial gain. And like I said, there is markets and a whole system set up with a lot of rural workers going out and shooting tens of thousands of roos, if not hundreds of thousands of roos, mainly around helping actually property owners just manage that population. And that's probably the closest thing we have to the American model here in Australia. Whereas a lot of these introduced what we'd call pest species, deer, pigs, goats, that type of thing, it's more of a sort of reactive model where it's managed by the state, but most of the time people aren't doing anything to manage a population until it gets to a sort of abundance level, which from previous histories sort of caused a reaction where we then go and spend thousands, if not millions, of taxpayer dollars to go and chop or shoot or poison these populations of animals, which is quite sort of sad, I guess, because what you're doing is you're not retrieving any of the meat, you're not managing a resource. You could be selling an experience to hunters to go and hunt and manage these populations and actually be making money, but it's a lot easier, and we probably don't do the best to advocate ourselves as hunters with obviously what's seen in the news, especially around, I want to say bow hunting as well, which is pretty sad. You see a lot of native animals that attract a lot of news with arrows in them. And the sad thing is it's probably, more likely to be a little kid with a target point that goes and does something silly rather than, for example, anyone that listens to this podcast or any, diehard hunter that's doing that sort of thing. But sadly, we all fit into the same umbrella, equally with habits and behaviors like poaching and hunting private property and that type of thing. Where, if you did that in the US, you would be looking at actual jail time. And it's something I'd probably encourage here, to be honest, where we have very sort of lenient laws, I guess, around that sort of behavior. Even people shooting and that type of thing of like penned deer and that type of stuff. Just painting hunting in the worst possible light and not really helping ourselves in the political realm. Another key difference is that the US model is developed on having public land access. So as we learnt in one of the podcasts with Austin, which is going to be coming up in the future, 75% of Utah is actually, block land management or public land where people have access to hunt, fish, hike, all those type of fantastic things. Whereas you look at Australia, and most of our hunting is done on private land with the management of those game animals essentially left up to the property owner. And you can have two property owners side by side that can have completely different sort of land and animal management systems. So you can have one farmer that goes and shoots every single pest animal. Equally, you can have one that harbors and keeps them all because they like it. So there is some guidelines now starting to come in terms of managing these feral game pest species where, you might need to show that you're, managing feral pig numbers or managing deer numbers, especially in these high sort of pockets and populations, equally for invasive weeds and species and stuff like that as well. But other than that, which is all similarly managed at the state level and all fairly loose, to be honest, there's not a lot of structure and sort of repercussions around that either. There's not really much being done other than what a property owner wants to do in terms of management for these species. We do have some public land opportunities here in Australia, especially New South Wales has done a great job, but they are fairly restricted in their access. And it would be great to see more opportunities opening up. Obviously, the high country in Victoria is another great one. But even then, we've had some fights recently trying to keep that access open. And sadly, I feel like it's one of these things that in Australia, at least, it's going to be one of these things that I don't see us, unless something radically changes and a massive unity forms, where we're going to be getting more public land to hunt. I think we're going to be under threat of losing the very little that we currently have already, which is sort of sad to see, but maybe something that hunters here in Australia and abroad can work together on in the future to hopefully open up some more public land opportunities here in Australia. Another stark difference between the US and Australia, and even New Zealand, is the trophy concept. So a lot of people I know here in Australia, sadly, just go out and shoot, for trophy, which is fine, and also managing populations. But you can tell just how passionate and how much of a cultural thing it is over there, that people just go explicitly, like there's more people that just go out with a cow tag and just try and get meat for the freezer for the year than go and try and shoot that big, huge bull elk. Here in Australia, there's probably more people that just go out and shoot something, and cut the head off rather than take any meat. But I think since COVID, there has been quite a big shift here in Australia, with a lot more people wanting to know where their meat comes from, and also just the positive benefits mentally and physically that come from hunting. And so there definitely has been a shift where, in the last 5 or so years, we've got a lot more people going out and wanting to know where their meat comes from and get it themselves as well. The hunting culture in the US is another one, with obviously people laugh at their rifle and firearms culture, but it is one of these things that I've got to say, here in Australia, we don't really have a hunting culture. We are a minority, really. New Zealand's done a fantastic job in bringing hunting into the way of life and how a lot of people live. And I think because of that, they've got a sort of a stronger foot in Parliament and a lot more voice. Here in Australia, we are losing or at least battling a lot of these rights that we see and face as hunters. But hopefully it's something that in the future we can all rally together and definitely have one voice. It's sort of something that Aidan and I discussed, I guess, in the secret, about how we can sort of unite. I guess in one way, part of us starting this podcast was just to start building that community and just have one voice, sort of display hunting in the best light as possibly can. It's why we do our YouTube videos and that sort of thing. And hopefully get more people into the sport that we're so passionate about. Just get everyone involved and show hunting in the best light we possibly can. And the last comparison to draw on is how we utilize a resource. So like I said earlier, in Australia and even New Zealand, it's more of a knee-jerk reaction where people just go out and essentially shoot whatever they want in our national parks and those type of things. If a population gets too high, then we just roll the choppers out and just shoot everything en masse, without any thought of, utilizing the meat, utilizing the resource, potentially earning funding by getting hunters in there to go and do it, or feeding families, feeding the homeless. The only real utilization of a resource we see here is probably when, I'd say, outfitters and safaris have come in to small scale land holdings, and often there's sort of a commercial management decision in that, where they want to manage the resource and only hunt the surplus animals. So that could be done through, for example, Aidan and I go, and on our Chiddle Safaris block, we actually go and cull hinds every year as well as stags. That's trying to keep the stag to hind ratio in check. But that's also from a conservation point of view, just because the population doubles every year. It's pretty quickly can get out of hand, especially in good seasons. So just trying to keep on top of that population, because at the end of the day, everyone likes to hunt lots and lots and lots of animals. It can actually be negative to a hunting experience, but it's also important to just keep these populations in check, as they are an invasive species and they do have a lot of impacts on the environment in too high numbers. Well, there you have it. Hopefully you've enjoyed the key differences between the Australian and New Zealand model compared to the North American big game model. As you can see, the culture and history of North America definitely outshines what we've got here going on in Australia and New Zealand. I mean, just having that science-backed system, and I think just the funding of hunters, just funding future hunters and ensuring that wildlife carries on for future populations is the key. We have a lot of political involvement here in Australia and don't really have a voice, whereas over in the US, it is heavily ingrained into their populations. And even something the other day where a state was trying to sell off their public lands for commercial gain. One of the biggest and loudest voices in this setting was hunters themselves. So we have to start advocating for ourselves better here in Australia. We probably need a bit more unity from all different hunting groups, whether it be rifle, bow, fishermen, duck hunters, pig doggers, all that type of thing. And just have a bit of stewardship and a bit of a community towards hunting in the future. And to be honest, I think it's one of these things that's going to need to start with us probably managing ourselves and managing other hunters to a higher expectation. So that's sort of, punishing legally, but also just socially and what's acceptable. Other hunters going and illegally jumping the fence, shooting things that they shouldn't, trespassing, those sort of things. Respecting bag limits, I guess, in the state, in the sense of, potentially hog deer hunting or duck hunting, that type of thing, hunting out of season. And yeah, just making it socially unacceptable, to go and jump the fence and go and, even though there is a red stag roaring 50 meters over the fence, it's 50 meters over the fence, and that means you shouldn't be over there. Just that type of thing. And I think hunting as a whole will just get displayed in a much better light, and hopefully enable us to have a bit more of a voice that we can carry into politics and parliament, and just have a bit more structure here in Australia for our hunting system, and try and treat these animals as a resource rather than just pest species or introduced species that, can be culled and done whatever they want with whenever they want, because I don't think it's the way forward for hunting and conservation here in Australia.
With unmatched quality, performance and reputation, Aimright International is a family and community-focused business. They're our go-to for spear guns, wetsuits and fins. Whether it be a simple shore dive, island hopping, days on the reef or bigger dives in the vast blue, Aimright has you covered underwater.
So what we're going to do now, which is probably going to be the most helpful section of this podcast for you guys, is just jump into a couple of, a glossary, a couple of terms that commonly get thrown around within the application system, which is especially going to help you in the next couple of podcasts when we talk to Austin about how to apply and, what tags are available and all those type of things, a bit of strategy in there as well. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was what we call OTC, so over-the-counter tags. So with that, what you can do is you can go up to any licensed vendor. So Colorado is a good example for just say their elk. So anywhere that there's a licensed vendor in Colorado, you can just go up, say, hey, I want to buy an elk tag, and you're going to go and get an elk tag from, a Walmart or any such place. Those opportunities are becoming less and less, as you'll hear in the podcast in the future, just because so many people want to hunt. And what happens, you get an abundance of hunters. So often you'll hear how there's so many hunters in Colorado during elk season. You see 10 times more hunters than you do elk. But generally speaking, these over-the-counter tags aren't designed to shoot big bulls or big deer or whatever species it's OTC for. It's mainly what we talk to or call like an opportunity, where there's good deer numbers or good elk numbers, for example, and they just want to get as many hunters out there as possible. So if you hear OTC, we're talking about over the counter, and that's bypassing that lottery system that we'll talk to and break down in a second. And you can just go up, anyone can buy a tag, and you can go out on the mountain and go and hunt. Now, as I mentioned, the rest of it is the lottery draw system, where you put your name into a hat, and we've got different types of systems within that. So the first one I'm going to discuss is what we call a preference point system. So a preference point system is where, just say, 1,000 people apply, and every time in the years previously, if you've applied for that tag, if you haven't drawn that tag, you get another point. So just say I've been applying for 10 years, I'll have 10 points. What then happens is I then go to apply, and they give the tags to the people with the most points who are applying. So we talk about, that's a 5-point unit, or that's a 7-point unit, or that's a 6-point unit, whatever. Some units are 25-point units. So what happens there is, if there's 1,000 people applying and there's 100 tags in that unit, for example, those tags are going to go to the top 100 preference points. So the preference point of the first person might be 20 years worth of applying, and then the next person might be 19, and then there might be a couple at 19, and then it might go all the way down to 16, for example, in which case you'd be wiping out a couple of years worth of preference points, which is actually going to make it easier to draw. The issue that we see is something called point creep, where just say there's 1,000 people applying and there's 50 people that have 20 years worth of points applying, but they only give out 40 tags. So that means that next year, out of the 50, 40 people that have 20 points have been given a tag. So there's still 10 left. So you get this phenomenon, I guess, where not all the people with the highest amount of points actually get given allocated tags because they're such rare tags. And so you get this like complex issue where, the amount of years required to draw a tag goes up and up and up, because next year, just say there's 10 people that have 21 tags left still, but then just say there's even more people with 20 years worth of tags. There's 60 people, just say, with it. So then all of a sudden, 10 people from the 21 get allocated, only 30 people from the 20 out of the 60 slot get allocated, and then there's 30 more that go to the next year and get 21, and so on and so on. And it builds up, and we commonly see this with sheep tags, mountain goat tags, moose tags, big deer, mule deer, those type of tags. With point creep, essentially, the summary of it is that there's more, they're really hard tags, and there's more people applying than there is tags allocated. And that sort of leads us into the next system, which is what we call a bonus point system, which generally speaking is just a luck of the draw system. But every year you apply, you get a point. And so what you can do is you can have 20 years worth of points in there, but that just means you've got 20 names in the hat. But you are more likely statistically to draw a unit, just say, than me when I have 1 point in the hat, but there's no guarantees you're ever going to get the tag. Like, you could apply for a unit for 60 years and never get a tag. So in some states as well, they do what they call a squared bonus point system. So if you've only got one application, your first year application, you've got one name in the hat. So it's 1 squared with 1, which is 1. If you've got 2, it's 2 times 2, which is 4. So if you've been applying for a unit for 20 years, you've got 20 times 20. So you've got 400 times your name is in the hat. So obviously you're 400 times more likely than someone that just is applying for the first year. My big elk hunt that I did a couple of years ago was this exact system. So there was guys in there that I ended up talking to and stuff, like one of my mates included. He's been applying for that unit for 23 years at the time and hadn't drawn it. He drew it the year after, and I was in there for my first year of applications. So I had one name in the hat. He alone had, 4 or whatever, 23 times 23 is. That's how many times his name was in the hat, let alone the other. I think there was about 400 applicants or 300 applicants that had, squared points worth. And hence it shows how lucky, I guess, I was to get that tag. But it also shows how, if you apply for as many things as I do, eventually you do get lucky, and sometimes your name gets drawn out. So hopefully that helps you guys understand the bonus point system. And a lot of these states have different, combinations. So some states have just a preference point system. Some have the bonus point system. Some have the squared bonus point system. It really does depend, but ultimately it's that lottery draw effectively. The next thing I want to talk about is what we talk about quotas. So that's sort of how many tags are allocated to a unit. So just say it was a really hard year for deer. What they might do, because we've mentioned how all of it's done off science, just say the deer population in that area was, 100,000 deer. They have a really hard winter and the deer populations are dropped back by 80%. Well, what happens, so the tag number may have been 5,000 tags, but because it's dropped back to 80%, the tag numbers are only now 1,000 tags. So they go proportionally. Equally, if there's more deer in the unit and they've responded really well, and just say in 5 years' time they're back up to their historical numbers of 10,000 deer in that unit, well, then they'll go back to allocating the normal amount of tags. But the quota is how many tags are in a unit. So if it's OTC, there's no limit of tags. Everyone in the US and the world could rock up and buy a tag. With most of the way that things go with the lottery system, there's a quota, and then that quota is then split up into what we call resident and non-residents. So if you live in Montana, for example, which obviously Aiden and I talk about because I've hunted there a couple of times now. So if you live in Montana, you're given an elk tag, and if you apply, you might be given a couple of elk tags. So you might get an archery tag, and you might get a rifle tag. You might get some deer tags. You might get some antelope tags. So what happens is a lot of the tags, so general tags, for example, get given to the residents. And then even within that, there's general tags, and then there's normally what we call limited entry tags. So a lot of these units have sort of general tags, which are easier to draw tags. And then there's ones that are what we call like limited entry or sort of harder tags to draw. And those are the ones where, there's more people applying. And so the pool may be 1,000 people applying, but there's only 50 to 100 tags, for example. And they're normally the top end units, the top end spots where you see, the big elk getting shot, the big deer getting shot. They're normally a lot of public land or easy access or good numbers with good mature animals for trophy class animals, rather than opportunity where there may be a lot of animals, but they're not going for age. And so they just want as many people out there hunting as possible. But the big thing with resident and non-resident is generally within that state, the state will only apply like 5 to 10% of the tags allocated to that unit for non-residents. So non-residents is anyone that doesn't live in the state. So we have as much chance, just say if we're talking about Montana, we have as much chance trying to get a tag as someone that lives just over the border in, Idaho or Utah or wherever. We're all the same. The only difference is when we look at going north and we talk about places like Alaska and stuff like that, there's non-residents, which is everyone in the US, and then there's non-resident aliens, which is us. So we get no sort of helping hand, I guess, there. And what ends up happening is when we go to apply in places like Alaska, for example, non-residents, so anyone from the US can go up there and do over-the-counter moose tags. So often people have seen that from Meat Eater and that type of thing. Whereas because we're non-resident aliens, we can't go up and do those sort of hunts. So that's a little bit of a pain, but just some sort of nomenclature to get around and just help you guys understand the systems. But as you can see, for us being non-residents, often applying in, these harder to get draws, it is quite hard to get some of these higher end tags, but that's where mainly for us, most of the time, you're trying to really get opportunities and then capitalize. We are, I would like to say, as Australian and Kiwis who mainly listen to this podcast, I do think we are some of the best hunters in the world just because we're out there doing it all the time. So if you're keen to go in there out the backcountry and put in the work, put in the time, you'll get your opportunities. But another thing that needs to be discussed is mandatory application, I guess. So what happens is if you apply in a state, so I've had this before where I applied in Utah and just say I had 3 years worth of points at that time. If you miss a year worth of application, you lose all your points. And so you often hear like people saying, I've been applying for a particular unit for 25 years or 20 years or 15 years. And you sort of get into this complex issue where you've been applying for so long and you've got enough, just say points, just say it's a preference point thing where it's like there's point creep and you've got, you're at the top of the hill or you're at the front of the race, but you haven't got enough points quite yet to draw it. But you don't also want to burn, there's other hunts that could be really good and you've got 25 years worth of points, but you don't want to drop down to a unit that's only got 18 years worth of preference points because you feel like you're wasting 7 years of applications in that state potentially. And that's also another way where we're seeing point creep at the moment, where there's people that are realizing in these top end units that aren't getting tags because the race is at 30 years, for example, and they're at 28 years. So they're going, "No, stuff it. I've been applying every year in this unit for 10 years and I'm not getting any closer because there's so few tags." And so you get people, what we call burning their points and then dropping down to sort of the next tier of preference points, where even though they've got 28 years worth of points, they're just like, "Nah, stuff it. I want to go on a hunt." And so they drop down to a unit that just say has 18 to 20 years worth of points, and you get enough people doing that. And obviously there's not that many tags in those units too. And then what was a 18 to 20 unit point, 18 to 20 years or points worth of unit, you end up getting jumps up in a year to 22 or 23 years, because you had a couple of these guys and girls that were at 25, to 30 applying. And so people that applied with 18 who thought they were going to get it miss out, and then you get more point creep, and so it continues. And so that's why a lot of us actually really like the bonus point system, just because it is luck of the draw. If you've got a heap of years worth of applying, then you are more likely to win, but there's no guarantees. Equally, there's someone with 1 year worth of points who can go in and draw it. So a lot of these states, I should mention too, it's split up generally by species. So there's some states that have like a combo. So Montana, for example, have like a deer and elk combo tag. They also have sometimes it's called like a deer tag. So you can hunt like whitetail or mule deer. But for the most part, if you're applying, you're getting a pronghorn tag or an elk tag or a mule deer tag or a bighorn sheep tag, and it's not like transferable. They're normally very specific. So it's like you can only hunt a branch antlered bull elk or a mule deer, for example, or it may be a male or female tag. It may be just a female tag. So they're generally very specific. You just need to really, really check the regs. The other thing is you'll get season dates for your hunt. So, and it'll specify the equipment that you can use. So generally speaking, it goes bow, muzzle, loader, rifle. So generally a lot of these bow hunts are during what would be the elk rut, and then later on the deer rut, which is a bit later, which is sort of October, November. You end up getting the rifle hunts and tags. And so the season for a lot of these dates starts sort of late August and go all the way through to October, November. There's some seasons that run a little bit later, into November, December, January. But for the most part, it's all concentrated around that rutting, and it goes from sort of September, October, November is the main dates in most of these states. You can do sort of what we call if you're a bow and arrow archery hunter and you get a rifle tag, you can take the bow in there or muzzle loader. So you can, whatever the tag permits, you can take like a sort of less sophisticated weapon, I guess, into that unit and that hunt. But some hunts also, if they're rifle, they require you to wear blaze orange as well. So just a few, things to be concerned about, I guess. And just making sure you're up to date with all the regs. If you are using Onyx, they're going to help as much as you can with all the guidelines, everything like that. So that's why we really recommend their service. The other thing to probably talk about is just land access. So there's a lot of public land, which, could be national forest, state land. We talk about BLM land, so block land management. So in a lot of these states, what they've done is the state actually pays the landowners if there's really good deer numbers or elk numbers or antelope numbers, and they pay for the hunting rights on their property. And then you have to just fill in an application permit. But anyone can go there, anyone can hunt. You obviously need to follow and respect the guidelines of the property. So sometimes they may be mustering, or sometimes they've got certain rules. We hunted BLM last year. Even though the state was managing their property, we couldn't hunt, even though we were hunting elk and had an elk and deer tag. We couldn't hunt the deer tag there because the property owners wanted the deer numbers to increase. So that, just those sort of things. The next is private land, which is anywhere where you need permission. So you need a what they call a trespassing fee, which is just a piece of paper or a bit of scribble on a piece of paper saying that you have permission. And that probably leads into us talking about landowner tags. So landowner tags, which we'll talk about a fair bit, is more of that high-end tag where landowners who allow, deer, elk species essentially to winter on their place and, cause some crop damage, cause some damage. get allocated landowner tags as compensation for that. And those landowner tags, they can either be sold directly to you guys as hunters, or they're generally sold through an outfitter. So you'll have an outfitter that guides on these big places, and that's how you hear about these big ranches. Those landowner tags normally go for a fair fee, but you are guided, you are hunting out of a lodge, you do have a lot of opportunity. And so if you've got the money, they are definitely an awesome hunt, and you're going to learn a lot. So they're a pretty good opportunity to just bypass that lottery system and get a tag straight away and get a lot of hunting under your belt in the US.
Born out of necessity, Day 6 designs and builds specialised equipment for hunters. Their arrows are bomb-proof and consistent. I'm currently running their 275 spine shafts. The split between the usual 250 and 300 spine shaft is perfect for the heavier broadhead that we run. Coming in at 11.8 grains per inch, this setup is perfect for all game here in Australia and beyond.
Well, hopefully that just helps you guys understand a bit of the terminology a little bit better that you're going to be hearing in the next couple of podcasts. Now we've just broken down everything for you so you can understand everything about the US big game model and what applying may look like. We're now going to jump into our FAQ listener questions. If you have a question from this podcast or any question surrounding hunting that you want answered, please email us at info@twinelements.com.au with the subject outline FAQ. Equally send us a message on Instagram at Twin Elements, Aidan Doumtsis Outdoors or James Doumtsis Outdoors, and we'll answer you there and feature you on a future podcast. So today's question is one that I've had a lot, especially the fair bit over the last few years with me going over to the US and being fairly successful, to be honest, and that is it worth buying points in the US even if I can't hunt every year? So essentially the short answer to this question is yes. Hopefully in the next couple of series that we've got going on, we're going to really emphasize and highlight that. But even hunting every year in like easy to draw tags can be quite difficult. And so I think gaining points in some of these harder to draw states is definitely something that you should start thinking about if you ever do want to go over and chase an elk or a mule deer or an antelope or anything like that. I had this conversation with Aidan a few years ago, and I sort of regret not pushing him harder, to be honest, to try and get him to start buying tags, because we've been using Hunting Fool for a fair few years now, and their strategies and everything like that do help you draw tags earlier. And, you know, they have a lot of information. That's essentially the service that you're paying them for. And they've helped me draw some fantastic tags and also helped me get more tags probably when I shouldn't have. But even with their guidance, it is still very hard to go and hunt, you know, an elk and a mule deer and an antelope, for example, every year. Having just say an extra 5 years worth of points up your sleeve, even if you don't want to hunt every year, is going to be a huge contributing factor to being able to go and hunt and probably have a better hunt with more opportunities in a couple of years, when you go and, you know, want to hunt an elk or a mule deer, an antelope, or whatever you want to hunt. But what I would say to this podcast is listen to the next series that we've got coming out, because what we've got next week is it's going to be done with a advisor from Hunting Fool called Austin Atkinson. He's a guide, he's an advisor, he's a very, very experienced hunter, and he's going to break down all of the application in the US. So we're going to talk about species on some of it, but some of it's just going to be talking about the big game model and how the tag system and the lottery system works. And hopefully what that's going to emphasize to you guys is it's not as simple as, oh, I want to go and hunt an elk next year, I'm just going to go and hunt an elk. I mean, there is places you can still do that, but opportunities are very low. It is quite a hard hunt, and generally speaking, we're not talking about huge elk or deer or anything like that. You can still go and shoot massive elk or whatever you're hunting in these units, but it is, I don't want to say impossible, but it's very, 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 very hard. If you want to go and hunt more of a trophy animal, a trophy hunt, then generally speaking, you have to wait or be very, very lucky to draw one of those tags, especially straight up. So having a little bit of planning, it doesn't cost a lot in some of these states. It might only cost $100 or just a little bit more US to buy a point. And so if you start now, even if you want to go and hunt a species in 5 years' time, it just means that you might have 5 points, which just increases the likelihood of getting potentially a better unit, having more opportunity, and hopefully securing the trophy of a lifetime. Well, that wraps up this episode and hopefully just gives you a bit of the background information and context into the North American big game model that you guys are going to need to carry forward into this little series that we're going to be doing. As I just mentioned, we've got Austin Atkinson coming on to discuss, how the tag system works, and then we're just going to break down it by species. So the first one's going to be elk, and then we're going to do deer species, antelope, jump into moose, and then a few other species as well. By the end of this little series, you guys are going to be well equipped. And to be honest, it's probably just going to be a bit of an eye-opener for a lot of people that aren't that familiar with the big game system that they've got over there. Just how hard it is to actually even go on a hunt. It is very, very difficult. For example, so far this year, I've only drawn a general deer and elk tag in Montana, which was a 50-50 chance of me going on that hunt. But everywhere else that I've applied haven't been successful anywhere yet. So, and that's, I think, up to 8 states that I'm up to now and got the draw results for. So there's still a few more that I'm waiting on. But it just goes to show that compared to Australia and New Zealand, if you do want to hunt over in the US, you really, really do need sort of a hunt management system or hunt strategy planned out. And mine goes for years and years and years, thinking that, okay, this next year I'm going to hunt this tag or try and get this tag with this many points this year, or try and draw this, so on and so forth. And so if you want to go over there, probably extending in from that last question, even in 5 years or 10 years, I would encourage you to start as soon as possible to try and get those points accumulated, but also just be in the draw to win that tag potentially sooner, because it is the luck of the draw and it can be quite difficult to get those tags. So I'd also advise using Hunting Full Service just purely because they've been so good, to be honest. Once again, Aiden and I get no kickbacks. The only reason why we've teamed up with them is because Aiden and I are so passionate about trying to get more hunters over to the US to experience the hunts that we've done. And so we've just found them to be a huge resource in that process of applying for tags and building that hunt strategy. And so we actually approached them to try and get that discount set up for you guys. So if you want to go over there, you get 25% off your first year's applications. Just email them at applications@huntingfull.com.au, or equally go to the Contact Us section on their website, and that's just huntingfull.com, and send an email there and just say you're from Australia, you've been sent from Twin Elements, and they'll give you 25% off your first year's applications. So another thing that we've done for you guys, our loyal listeners, is set up our unique Prints discount code. And so if you guys use the code the Twin Elements podcast on our Twin Elements website, you'll get 10% off any prints that you want. We've got 40 prints up there. So there's wildlife ones, there's Northern Territory ones, there's US ones, deer species, pigs, cows, all the rest of it. Great for the office, great for presents, great just to have. I've got a couple above my desk here where I'm working at the moment. And so if you guys want to grab some prints, use the Twin Elements podcast for 10% off. And thank you for those that do order. Just support Aiden and I here at Twin Elements and enable us to do more of what we love doing, and that is doing podcasts for you, filming more hunts and that type of thing, and just building that whole community. And yeah, it's just been an absolute great journey so far. This actually marks the 24th podcast that we've done, and we're loving it. It's been an interesting experience. The podcast and everything really this year is just going up in leaps and bounds. It's taken on a whole new meaning for Aiden and I, which means a lot more work, but we're also getting a lot more love from you guys. So thank you very much for all of that. And that's extended into, with this podcast, if you guys could subscribe, review, and rate the podcast, it just helps it get abroad and more people see it. So we would really appreciate it. If you haven't done that, please do that. And once again, thank you for all the love and support. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this podcast. Hopefully you've learned something, and hopefully it inspires even one person to get over and talk to Hunt Full or just do some applications for the US, and it'll make it all worth it for Aiden and I. So if that's you, please let us know on the socials, because it'll make our day. But for now, once again, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Twin Elements podcast.